In a world where secrets hide behind ordinary faces, sometimes the most incredible revelations come from the most unexpected places. What would you do if you discovered that the quiet woman sitting next to you on a bus, the one who looks like she could be your neighbor or your sister, actually holds one of the most classified pieces of intelligence in military history? This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a 28-year-old librarian from Phoenix, Arizona, whose life took an extraordinary turn when she decided to honor her late brother's memory with what she thought was a simple tattoo. Little did she know that this single act of love and remembrance would connect her to one of the most elite military units in the world, reveal family secrets that had been buried for decades, and ultimately change the course of her entire existence. Sometimes the most ordinary people carry the most extraordinary stories. Sometimes a single moment of recognition can bridge worlds that were never meant to meet. This is one of those stories, a tale of courage, family bonds, hidden histories, and the incredible power of symbols that transcend time and circumstance. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried, and when a simple act of remembrance opens doors to a reality more complex and dangerous than anything you could imagine? Sarah Martinez was about to find out. Sarah Martinez had always considered herself remarkably unremarkable. At 28, she lived a quiet life that followed a predictable rhythm. Every morning at 7, she would wake up in her small apartment in Phoenix, Arizona, make herself a cup of coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream, and prepare for another day at the Phoenix Public Library where she worked as a research librarian. Her colleagues knew her as the dependable one, the woman who never missed a day, never complained about overtime, and could locate any obscure reference faster than their computer systems. The apartment she called home was a modest 1-bedroom unit in a complex that housed mostly young professionals and retirees. The walls were painted in neutral beiges and whites, decorated with family photographs, and a few pieces of art she had picked up at local craft fairs. Everything about Sarah's life suggested someone who preferred to blend into the background, someone who found comfort in routine and stability. Her wardrobe consisted mainly of cardigans, modest blouses, and comfortable flats, the kind of clothing that would never draw attention in a crowd. But beneath this ordinary exterior, Sarah carried a weight that had shaped every decision she had made for the past 3 years. Her older brother, Miguel, had been killed in military action overseas when she was 25. The loss had devastated not just Sarah, but their entire family. Miguel had been the golden child, the one with the bright future, the one who had joined the military with dreams of serving his country and making a difference. Sarah had always lived in his shadow, and when that shadow disappeared, she found herself lost in a world that suddenly felt too large and too empty. Miguel had been deployed to Afghanistan as part of a special operations unit. The details of his death had been classified, shared with the family only in the vaguest terms. They were told he had died serving his country, that he had been a hero, and that his sacrifice had saved the lives of his fellow soldiers. But for Sarah, these words felt hollow. She wanted to know more about her brother's final months, about the person he had become during his service, about the experiences that had changed him during his brief visits home. After Miguel's funeral, Sarah had struggled with grief that seemed to have no outlet. She had tried counseling. She had tried throwing herself into her work. She had even tried traveling to places Miguel had loved when they were children. Nothing seemed to fill the void his absence had created. It was during one of her lowest moments, sitting alone in her apartment on what would have been Miguel's 30th birthday, that Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She decided to get a tattoo in Miguel's memory. It seemed like such a simple thing, a way to carry a piece of him with her always. Sarah had never been interested in tattoos before. She had always been the careful one, the rule follower, the sister who stayed home and studied while Miguel went out and lived adventures. But something about permanently marking her skin with a symbol of their connection felt right, felt necessary. The process of choosing the right tattoo consumed her for weeks. She went through Miguel's belongings, looking for something meaningful, something that would capture who he had been. In a box of his military gear that had been returned to the family, she found a small notebook filled with his handwriting. Most of the entries were routine notes about training exercises and daily life on base. But, on one page, Miguel had drawn a detailed sketch of what appeared to be a military insignia or symbol. The symbol was unlike anything Sarah had seen before. It featured an eagle with outstretched wings, but the design was more intricate than standard military eagles. The bird's talons grasped not the typical olive branches or arrows, but what appeared to be lightning bolts. Below the eagle was a banner with letters that she couldn't quite make out in Miguel's handwriting, and the entire design was surrounded by a circular border that contained smaller symbols she didn't recognize. When Sarah took the notebook to a tattoo artist, she expected him to clean up the design and perhaps add some personal touches. Instead, the artist, a veteran named Jake who specialized in military tattoos, stared at the drawing for a long time before asking her where she had gotten it. Sarah explained about her brother and his service, and Jake's expression grew serious. He told her that while he could certainly create a tattoo based on the drawing, she should be aware that the symbol appeared to be military in nature, and she might want to research it further before permanently marking her skin with it. Sarah appreciated Jake's caution, but her research into the symbol yielded nothing. She searched online military databases, looked through books about military insignia, and even contacted a friend who worked for the Veterans Administration. No one could identify the symbol, and most people suggested it might have been something Miguel had designed himself, perhaps as a personal emblem or a design for his unit. Satisfied that the symbol was unique to Miguel, Sarah decided to proceed with the tattoo. She chose to have it placed on her left shoulder blade, where it would normally be hidden by clothing, but where she could still see it when she looked in the mirror. The tattoo session took 3 hours, during which Jake worked meticulously to reproduce every detail of Miguel's drawing. When it was finished, Sarah felt a sense of completion she hadn't experienced since her brother's death. For the next 6 months, the tattoo served its intended purpose. It was a private memorial that helped Sarah feel connected to Miguel in her daily life. She would sometimes trace the design with her fingers when she was missing him particularly badly, and it provided a comfort that nothing else had been able to offer. The tattoo remained her secret, hidden under professional clothing during the day and visible only to herself in the privacy of her own home. During this period, Sarah began to slowly rebuild her life. She started dating again, reconnected with friends she had neglected during her grieving process, and even began taking evening classes in art history at the local community college. The tattoo had given her a sense of closure that allowed her to move forward while still honoring Miguel's memory. It was on a particularly warm Thursday in late spring that Sarah's ordinary life took an extraordinary turn. She had been working late at the library, helping a graduate student locate sources for a thesis on military history. The library's air conditioning system had been having problems all week, and by closing time, the building was uncomfortably warm. Sarah decided to change out of her professional cardigan and into a sleeveless blouse she kept in her desk for emergencies. She was walking to her car in the library parking lot when she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. Phoenix was home to several military installations, so military aircraft weren't uncommon, but something about this particular helicopter caught her attention. As she looked up, she saw it was an Apache attack helicopter, flying lower than usual and heading toward what appeared to be Luke Air Force Base. What happened next would remain etched in Sarah's memory for the rest of her life. As she stood watching the helicopter pass overhead, she noticed a figure rappelling down from a training exercise at a nearby facility. The Apache pilot seemed to adjust the aircraft's position to get a better view of something on the ground. Through a series of coincidences that seemed impossible to believe, the pilot's line of sight included the parking lot where Sarah stood. Later, she would learn that Chief Warrant Officer David Chun had been flying routine training missions for over 15 years. He was known among his peers as one of the most skilled and unflappable pilots in the unit. Chun had flown combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, had navigated through hostile fire, and had successfully completed more dangerous extractions than most pilots would see in an entire career. Nothing in his extensive military experience had prepared him for what he saw that evening in a civilian parking lot in Phoenix. Through his aircraft's advanced optical systems, which he had been using to observe the training exercise, Chun caught sight of Sarah standing next to her car. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just a woman in civilian clothes looking up at his aircraft. But, as she moved and the angle changed, the evening sun illuminated something on her exposed shoulder that made Chun's blood run cold. The symbol tattooed on Sarah's shoulder blade was not, as she had believed, a design of her brother's creation. It was one of the most classified insignias in the United States military, known only to members of an elite special operations unit so secret that its very existence was denied by official channels. The unit, known internally as Shadow Wing, had been responsible for some of the most sensitive operations in recent military history. The insignia was never supposed to exist outside of classified documents and the personal effects of unit members. Chen had seen this symbol only a handful of times in his career, always in situations involving the highest levels of security clearance. He knew that unauthorized possession or display of the insignia was a federal offense, and that anyone bearing the symbol had either been part of operations so classified that their families would never know the truth, or was in possession of intelligence that could compromise national security. As the Apache continued its flight path, Chen found himself torn between military protocol and an overwhelming curiosity about the woman in the parking lot. His training told him to report the incident immediately to his commanding officer. The presence of classified military insignia on a civilian could indicate anything from a security breach to an active intelligence operation. But something about the woman's demeanor, the way she had simply been standing there looking at his aircraft with innocent curiosity, suggested that she had no idea of the significance of what she was wearing. That evening, Chief Warrant Officer Chen faced a decision that would ultimately lead to revelations that would change multiple lives and expose secrets that had been buried for over a decade. Sarah Martinez, the ordinary librarian who thought she was simply honoring her brother's memory, was about to discover that her family's history was far more complex and dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. The tattoo that had given her comfort and closure was actually a key that would unlock doors to a world of classified operations, family secrets, and questions about her brother's death that had never been asked. The ordinary woman walking to her car after a routine day at work was about to become the center of a story that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, her family, and the true cost of military service. As Sarah drove home that evening, unaware that she had been observed, she had no way of knowing that her quiet life was about to be shattered by revelations that would force her to question everything she had believed about her brother's service and sacrifice. The next morning would bring visitors she never expected, questions she was unprepared to answer, and the beginning of a journey that would take her far from the safety and predictability of her ordinary existence. The woman who had seemed so unremarkable to everyone around her was about to discover that sometimes the most important stories begin with the most unlikely people, and that the symbols we choose to mark our bodies with can have consequences that reach far beyond our understanding. Sarah's story was just beginning, and it would prove that there are no truly ordinary people, only ordinary circumstances waiting for extraordinary events to reveal the hidden depths beneath the surface. The morning after the helicopter encounter started like any other for Sarah Martinez. She woke at 7, made her coffee with 2 sugars and cream, and prepared for what she expected to be another routine day at the Phoenix Public Library. The previous evening's glimpse of the Apache helicopter had already faded from her consciousness, just another unremarkable moment in her carefully ordered life. She had no way of knowing that her photograph was already being analyzed in a secure facility at Luke Air Force Base, or that her existence had become a matter of urgent interest to people she had never met. Chief Warrant Officer David Chun had barely slept. After landing his Apache the previous evening, he had immediately reported the incident to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison. The conversation had been brief, but intense. Chun described what he had seen, provided the exact coordinates of the sighting, and emphasized his certainty about the identification of the classified insignia. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, a man who had built his career on maintaining absolute security protocols, understood immediately that they were dealing with a potential breach of national security. Within hours, a small team of military intelligence officers had been assembled. The team included Major Lisa Rodriguez, a specialist in counterintelligence operations, Captain Michael Foster, an expert in classified insignia and unit identification, and Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, a digital forensics specialist. Their mission was straightforward: identify the civilian who had been displaying the classified symbol, determine how she had obtained it, and assess the level of security risk her knowledge might represent. The first step was enhancing the images Chun had captured through his aircraft's optical systems. Staff Sergeant Walsh worked through the night, using advanced software to clarify the photographs and extract every possible detail. The quality was remarkable, clear enough to identify not only the insignia itself, but also the precision of its reproduction. This was not a crude approximation or an accidentally similar design. Every detail of the classified symbol had been perfectly recreated, down to the smallest elements that were known only to current and former members of Shadow Wing. Major Rodriguez took the lead on the civilian identification process. Using facial recognition software and cross-referencing with local databases, the team quickly identified Sarah Martinez. Her employment records, educational background, family history, and even her library lending habits were compiled into a comprehensive profile. On the surface, everything about Sarah suggested exactly what she appeared to be: an ordinary librarian with no military connections and no apparent reason to possess classified intelligence. But when the team began investigating Sarah's family history, they encountered their first significant discovery. Miguel Martinez had indeed served in the military, and his service record showed deployment to Afghanistan as part of a special operations unit. However, when Captain Foster attempted to access the specific details of Miguel's unit assignment and mission history, he found that large portions of the file had been classified at levels that exceeded even his considerable security clearance. This discovery transformed the investigation from a routine security inquiry into something far more complex. The team realized they were not dealing with a simple case of unauthorized possession of classified materials. Sarah's brother had apparently been involved in operations so sensitive that the details remained classified years after his death. The insignia on Sarah's tattoo was not stolen or leaked intelligence. It was a piece of her family's history that she had every right to possess, but which connected her to military operations that were still considered matters of national security. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison faced a delicate situation. Military protocol demanded that Sarah be brought in for questioning immediately. Anyone displaying classified military insignia without authorization needed to be investigated, regardless of how they had obtained the symbol. However, the family connection complicated matters. If Miguel Martinez had been a legitimate member of Shadow Wing, then his sister had a moral right to honor his service, even if she didn't understand the classified nature of the symbol she was displaying. The decision was made to approach Sarah directly, but carefully. Rather than sending military police or conducting a formal arrest, the team would make contact in a way that would allow them to assess her knowledge and intentions while respecting her status as the family member of a fallen soldier. Major Rodriguez volunteered to make the initial contact, believing that a woman officer might be less intimidating and more likely to encourage honest communication. Sarah was in the middle of cataloging new acquisitions when the library's front desk receptionist informed her that someone was asking to speak with her. The woman waiting in the library's small conference room was impeccably dressed in civilian clothes, but something about her posture and bearing immediately suggested military training. Major Rodriguez introduced herself using only her civilian name and title, explaining that she was conducting research related to military families and veterans services. For the first 20 minutes of their conversation, Major Rodriguez asked general questions about Sarah's work, her family, and her experiences as the sister of a fallen soldier. Sarah answered honestly and openly, discussing her grief, her struggle to find meaning after Miguel's death, and her gradual process of rebuilding her life. She spoke about the pride she felt in Miguel's service and her desire to honor his memory in some meaningful way. It was only when Major Rodriguez gently brought up the subject of memorial tattoos that Sarah's demeanor changed slightly. She became more cautious, though not defensive. She explained that she had indeed gotten a tattoo in Miguel's memory, but that it was personal and private. When pressed for details, Sarah described finding the symbol in Miguel's notebook and her decision to reproduce it as a permanent memorial. Major Rodriguez recognized that Sarah was being completely truthful. Her body language, her emotional responses, and her detailed account of the decision-making process all indicated genuine honesty. This was not someone who was hiding knowledge of classified operations or attempting to deceive military investigators. Sarah truly believed that the symbol was something her brother had designed himself, a personal emblem that had meaning only to their family. The conversation reached a critical moment when Major Rodriguez asked if she could see the tattoo. Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request, but eventually agreed. When she removed her cardigan and turned to show her shoulder blade, Major Rodriguez had to suppress her own reaction. The insignia was perfect, not just accurate, but executed with a level of detail that suggested the original drawing had been created by someone with intimate knowledge of its significance. Major Rodriguez made a decision that would later be debated by her superiors. Instead of immediately revealing the classified nature of the symbol, she asked Sarah if she would be willing to speak with other people who might be able to provide more information about her brother's service. She explained that sometimes military records contained details that weren't shared with families, and that there might be people who could help Sarah better understand Miguel's experiences during his deployment. Sarah agreed, though she was clearly puzzled by the sudden interest in her brother's service. She had tried for years to learn more about Miguel's military experiences, only to be told repeatedly that the information was not available to family members. The possibility that she might finally get answers to her questions was both exciting and nerve-wracking. That evening, as Sarah sat in her apartment waiting for what she had been told would be a follow-up phone call, she found herself thinking more deeply about Miguel's final months than she had in years. She pulled out the notebook where she had found the symbol, reading through her brother's brief entries with new attention. Most of the writing was mundane: notes about training schedules, complaints about the food, brief mentions of his fellow soldiers. But there were also entries that seemed more significant in light of the day's conversation. Miguel had written about feeling isolated from his unit, about being assigned to missions that he couldn't discuss even in his private notebook. He had mentioned receiving specialized training that was different from what other soldiers in his company were experiencing. Most telling was an entry written just weeks before his death, in which Miguel expressed frustration about not being able to share the true nature of his work with his family. Sarah realized that she had read these entries many times before, but had always interpreted them as the normal complaints of a soldier dealing with military bureaucracy and the stress of deployment. Now, for the first time, she began to wonder if Miguel's experiences had been more unique and more significant than she had ever understood. The phone call came 3 hours later than promised. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Colonel Harrison, and he asked if Sarah would be willing to meet with a small group of people who had worked with her brother during his final deployment. The meeting would take place the next day at Luke Air Force Base, and while he couldn't provide details over the phone, Colonel Harrison assured her that the conversation would help her understand Miguel's service and sacrifice in ways that had previously been impossible. Sarah agreed immediately, though she spent the night wondering what she was about to learn. Part of her was excited by the possibility of finally getting answers to questions that had haunted her for years. Another part was afraid of what those answers might reveal. She had built her understanding of Miguel's death around the few details she had been given, and she wasn't sure she was prepared to have that understanding completely restructured. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror and studied the tattoo on her shoulder blade. For the first time since getting it, she looked at the symbol not as a memorial to her brother, but as a piece of evidence in a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. Every line, every detail of the insignia seemed to carry a significance she had never recognized. The woman who had gotten the tattoo as a simple act of remembrance was about to discover that nothing about her brother's service had been simple. The symbol she carried on her skin was not just a memorial. It was a key to understanding a part of military history that few people were ever meant to know about. And Sarah Martinez, the ordinary librarian who had never wanted anything more than to honor her brother's memory, was about to become an extraordinary participant in a story that would challenge everything she thought she knew about war, sacrifice, and the true cost of keeping national secrets. The next morning would bring revelations that would forever change how Sarah understood her family's history, her brother's sacrifice, and her own place in a story much larger and more complex than she had ever imagined. The recognition of her tattoo by an Apache pilot had set in motion a series of events that would ultimately expose truths that had been hidden for years and transform an ordinary woman's quest for closure into something far more significant and dangerous than she could have ever anticipated. Sarah Martinez had never been on a military base before, and as she drove through the gates of Luke Air Force Base, she felt a mixture of nervous excitement and deep apprehension. The security checkpoint had been more thorough than she expected, with guards examining her identification multiple times and making phone calls to verify her appointment. Everything about the experience reinforced her growing sense that she was about to learn something significant about her brother's service. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison met her at the visitors center, and Sarah was immediately struck by his bearing. Unlike Major Rodriguez, who had been warm and approachable during their library meeting, Colonel Harrison projected an authority that was both reassuring and intimidating. He was a man clearly accustomed to dealing with serious matters, and his presence suggested that whatever Sarah was about to learn would be far from routine. The conference room where Sarah was led was unlike any meeting space she had ever seen. The walls were bare except for official military photographs, and the table was surrounded by chairs that looked designed for long, serious conversations. Already seated were Major Rodriguez, whom Sarah recognized, and two other people who introduced themselves simply as Captain Foster and Staff Sergeant Walsh. The formality of the setting made Sarah realize that this was not going to be the informal conversation about Miguel's service that she had been expecting. Colonel Harrison began by explaining that everything discussed in the room was classified and covered by national security regulations. Sarah would need to sign several documents acknowledging her understanding of the sensitive nature of the information she was about to receive and agreeing to maintain absolute confidentiality about the details of the conversation. The paperwork was intimidating, filled with legal language about federal penalties and criminal prosecution, but Sarah signed without hesitation. Her need to understand Miguel's story outweighed her concerns about the implications. Once the formalities were completed, Captain Foster opened a folder and removed several photographs. The first was an enlarged image of Sarah's tattoo, obviously taken from some distance, but remarkably clear in its detail. Seeing her own skin displayed as evidence in a military investigation was surreal and unsettling. The second photograph was of the same insignia, but this time it appeared on what looked like an official military document. Captain Foster explained that the symbol Sarah had tattooed on her shoulder was the classified insignia of Shadow Wing, a special operations unit that officially did not exist. The unit had been created to conduct missions that were too sensitive to be acknowledged by regular military channels, operations that required absolute secrecy and complete deniability. Only a select few individuals had ever been authorized to display the insignia, and fewer still had ever been permitted to retain any physical evidence of their association with the unit. Sarah's initial reaction was confusion rather than shock. She struggled to understand how Miguel could have been part of something so significant without her family ever knowing. Miguel had been special to her, certainly, but she had never thought of him as the kind of person who would be selected for elite military operations. He had been a good student, but not exceptional, a competent athlete, but not outstanding. He had joined the military partly because he couldn't decide what else to do with his life after college. Major Rodriguez recognized Sarah's confusion and began to explain how special operations recruitment actually worked. The military didn't always select people based on obvious qualifications or exceptional abilities. Sometimes they looked for individuals who possessed qualities that were harder to identify. People who could adapt quickly to unusual situations, who could maintain their composure under extreme stress, and who could be trusted absolutely with information that could never be shared with anyone, including their closest family members. Miguel, it turned out, had displayed exactly these qualities during his initial training. He had been identified as a candidate for Shadow Wing not because he was the strongest or the smartest soldier in his unit, but because he demonstrated an unusual combination of reliability, adaptability, and emotional stability. His superiors had noticed that Miguel never talked about his work outside of official channels, never sought attention or recognition for his achievements, and never seemed to struggle with the isolation that special operations required. The selection process for Shadow Wing had taken place over several months during Miguel's deployment. He had been gradually separated from his regular unit and given specialized training that prepared him for missions requiring absolute secrecy. The training had been intensive and dangerous, designed not just to develop technical skills, but to ensure that unit members could handle the psychological pressure of carrying out operations that they could never discuss with anyone. Staff Sergeant Walsh opened another folder and began describing the specific operations in which Miguel had participated during his final months. The missions had involved intelligence gathering in areas of Afghanistan that were considered too dangerous for conventional forces. Miguel and his team had been responsible for collecting information about terrorist networks and weapons suppliers, often spending weeks embedded in hostile territory with no backup and no communication with their base. The work had been extraordinarily dangerous, but it had also been crucial to broader military objectives in the region. Intelligence gathered by Shadow Wing had prevented multiple terrorist attacks and had led to the capture of several high-value targets. Miguel's contributions to these operations had been significant, though his family had never been told anything about the true nature of his service. Sarah found herself struggling to reconcile this description of her brother with the person she had known. The Miguel she remembered had been cautious and thoughtful, someone who preferred books to adventure and who had seemed almost reluctant about his military service. The idea that he had been conducting dangerous covert operations in enemy territory seemed impossible to believe. Major Rodriguez addressed Sarah's doubts directly. She explained that many family members had similar reactions when they learned about their loved one's involvement in classified operations. The people selected for units like Shadow Wing were often chosen precisely because they seemed unremarkable. Their ability to blend in, to avoid drawing attention to themselves, and to maintain normal relationships despite the extraordinary nature of their work was part of what made them effective operators. The conversation took a more difficult turn when Colonel Harrison began discussing the circumstances of Miguel's death. The official report had stated that Miguel had been killed during routine patrol operations, but the truth was far more complex. Miguel had died during a mission to gather intelligence about a planned terrorist attack on American forces. He and his team had been discovered while conducting surveillance in a remote village, and Miguel had been killed while covering the retreat of his fellow soldiers. Miguel's actions during the mission had saved the lives of his entire team and had prevented intelligence about Shadow Wing operations from falling into enemy hands. The information he had gathered before his death had led to the prevention of a major terrorist attack that would have killed dozens of American soldiers and Afghan civilians. Miguel had died a hero in the truest sense, though his family had never been able to know the details of his sacrifice. Sarah was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. The brother she had mourned as a good soldier who had died serving his country had actually been an elite operator who had given his life to save others and prevent a major terrorist attack. The grief she had carried for years was suddenly compounded by a pride she had never been allowed to feel and an anger at having been denied knowledge of Miguel's true achievements. The meeting continued for several more hours as the military officers provided additional details about Shadow Wing operations and Miguel's role within the unit. Sarah learned that her brother had volunteered for increasingly dangerous missions, that he had been recommended for decorations that could never be publicly acknowledged, and that he had been considered one of the most reliable and effective members of his unit. But perhaps the most significant revelation came when Captain Foster explained how Miguel had created the insignia design that Sarah had found in his notebook. Unit members were strictly forbidden from retaining any physical evidence of their association with Shadow Wing. But Miguel had been granted special permission to create a personal copy of the insignia that he could keep in his private possessions. The permission had been granted because of his exceptional service record and because his commanding officers recognized his need to maintain some connection to his work that he could share with his family after his deployment ended. Miguel had never intended for the insignia to be permanently hidden from his family. His plan had been to survive his deployment and eventually share at least some details of his service with Sarah and their parents. The drawing in his notebook had been his way of preserving a piece of his military experience that he could someday use to help his family understand the significance of his service without violating security protocols. Miguel's death had prevented him from ever having that conversation with his family, but his decision to preserve the insignia had ultimately led to Sarah learning the truth about his service. The tattoo she had gotten as a simple memorial had become the key that unlocked the story Miguel had always intended to share. The emotional impact of these revelations was intense and complex. Sarah felt pride in Miguel's achievements and gratitude for finally understanding the true nature of his sacrifice. But she also felt anger at the years of partial truth and incomplete information her family had been given. The grief process she thought she had completed was suddenly reopened, complicated by new knowledge that changed everything she thought she understood about her loss. Colonel Harrison addressed Sarah's emotional response with surprising sensitivity. He explained that the decision to maintain secrecy around Shadow Wing operations was never made lightly, and that the military understood the additional burden this secrecy placed on grieving families. However, the nature of the unit's work required absolute confidentiality, even after the death of unit members. The fact that Sarah was now being given this information represented an unprecedented exception to standard security protocols. The exception had been made for several reasons. Sarah's display of the classified insignia had created a security situation that required investigation, but the investigation had revealed that she had a legitimate family connection to the symbol. More importantly, the military had determined that Sarah's knowledge of her brother's true service could actually enhance security rather than compromise it. Her understanding of the significance of the tattoo would ensure that she treated the symbol with appropriate respect and discretion. As the meeting concluded, Sarah was given additional documents that provided more details about Miguel's service and the specific operations in which he had participated. She was also provided with contact information for other family members of Shadow Wing personnel, people who had gone through similar experiences of learning the truth about their loved one's classified service. The drive home from Luke Air Force Base was one of the longest of Sarah's life. Her mind was reeling with new information and trying to process emotions she had never expected to feel. The brother she had known and mourned had been real, but he had also been only part of the story. The complete Miguel was someone far more complex and heroic than she had ever imagined. Someone whose true achievements had been hidden not just from her, but from the world. The tattoo on her shoulder blade, which had begun as a simple memorial, had become something far more significant. She now carried on her skin one of the most classified symbols in the United States military, a mark that connected her not just to Miguel's memory, but to a community of elite soldiers and their families who shared the burden of protecting secrets that could never be fully revealed. Sarah Martinez, who had always considered herself ordinary, now understood that she was part of an extraordinary story. Her simple act of love and remembrance had connected her to a hidden world of classified operations and national security, and had ultimately given her access to truths about her family's history that few people were ever permitted to know. The revelation of what her tattoo really meant had changed everything, and Sarah was about to discover that knowledge of this magnitude comes with responsibilities and consequences she had never anticipated. The weeks following Sarah's revelation at Luke Air Force Base brought changes to her life that she could never have anticipated. Knowledge of Miguel's true service and the classified nature of her tattoo created a new reality that affected everything from her daily routines to her deepest relationships. The ordinary librarian who had simply wanted to honor her brother's memory had become part of a carefully managed national security situation that required constant awareness and adaptation. The first immediate change was in Sarah's relationship with her own body and the tattoo she carried. What had once been a source of comfort and private connection to Miguel had become a symbol that demanded careful consideration of when and how it could be displayed. She was provided with detailed guidelines about concealing the insignia in public situations, avoiding photography that might capture the symbol, and ensuring that the tattoo was never visible during any form of official documentation or identification process. These restrictions were not just suggestions, but legal requirements backed by federal law. Sarah had to sign additional documents acknowledging her understanding that unauthorized display of the classified insignia could result in criminal prosecution, even though she had obtained the symbol through legitimate family connections. The weight of carrying such sensitive information began to affect her in ways she hadn't expected, creating a constant underlying awareness that she possessed knowledge that most people were never meant to have. The psychological impact of learning the truth about Miguel's service was profound and complex. Sarah found herself grieving her brother's death all over again, but from an entirely new perspective. The simple soldier she had mourned had been replaced in her understanding by an elite operative whose sacrifices had been far greater than she had ever known. This new knowledge brought both pride and anger, pride in Miguel's extraordinary achievements and anger at the years of incomplete information that had shaped her original grief process. Sarah also struggled with the isolation that came with her new knowledge. She could not share the details of what she had learned with her parents, her friends, or anyone else in her life. The burden of carrying such significant information alone was emotionally exhausting. She found herself analyzing every conversation, every casual comment about military service or Miguel's memory, to ensure that she didn't accidentally reveal classified information. The military had anticipated these challenges and provided Sarah with resources to help her adapt to her new situation. She was connected with Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in working with family members of personnel involved in classified operations. Dr. Williams helped Sarah develop strategies for managing the emotional complexity of her situation and processing her revised understanding of Miguel's service and sacrifice. Through her sessions with Dr. Williams, Sarah learned that her experience was not unique. There were other family members who had discovered the classified nature of their loved one's service, and many of them struggled with similar feelings of isolation and emotional complexity. The knowledge that she was not alone in dealing with these challenges provided some comfort, though it also emphasized the serious nature of the situation she had become part of. One of the most unexpected consequences of Sarah's new status was the development of relationships within the military community. Major Rodriguez maintained regular contact with her, ostensibly to ensure that Sarah was adapting well to the security requirements. But the relationship gradually became more personal. Sarah found that Major Rodriguez, who had extensive experience with classified operations, was one of the few people who could understand the unique challenges Sarah was facing. Through Major Rodriguez, Sarah was introduced to other family members of Shadow Wing personnel. These connections were carefully managed and occurred only after extensive background checks and security clearances, but they provided Sarah with a support network of people who shared similar experiences. She met Maria Santos, whose husband had served in Shadow Wing and been killed in a mission that officially never happened. She met James Chun, whose son had been part of operations that had prevented terrorist attacks, but could never be publicly acknowledged. These relationships were both comforting and sobering. Sarah gained appreciation for the broader community of families who carried similar secrets and shared similar burdens. But she also began to understand the long-term implications of her situation. These were not temporary restrictions or short-term security measures. The classified nature of Miguel's service meant that Sarah would carry these secrets for the rest of her life, and that her knowledge would continue to affect her choices and relationships indefinitely. The impact on Sarah's professional life was subtle but significant. Her work at the Phoenix Public Library continued much as before, but she found herself more aware of research requests related to military history or classified operations. She developed new protocols for handling such requests, ensuring that her personal knowledge never influenced her professional responses. The library's policy of providing equal access to public information took on new meaning when Sarah realized how much information existed that would never be accessible through public channels. Sarah's personal relationships also began to change, though in ways that were often difficult to define. She found herself withdrawing slightly from friends and family members, not because she wanted to distance herself from them, but because the constant need to monitor her conversations for potential security violations created a barrier that hadn't existed before. Social situations that had once been relaxing became exercises in careful communication management. The changes were particularly noticeable in her dating life. Sarah had been slowly rebuilding her romantic relationships after Miguel's death, but her new security status complicated these efforts. Any serious relationship would eventually require her to navigate questions about her military connections and the significance of her tattoo. The idea of explaining her situation to someone who didn't already understand the complexities of classified operations seemed overwhelming and potentially dangerous. About 2 months after her initial meeting at Luke Air Force Base, Sarah faced her first real test of how her new knowledge would affect her daily life. She was approached by a journalist working on a story about military families and their experiences with incomplete information about their loved one's service. The journalist had somehow learned that Sarah was the sister of a soldier who had died in Afghanistan, and he wanted to interview her for his article about the challenges faced by families seeking closure. The interview request forced Sarah to confront the practical implications of her security clearance in a real-world situation. She could not simply refuse the interview without explanation, as that might draw more attention to her situation. But she also could not participate in the interview without risking the disclosure of classified information. The situation required careful coordination with her military contacts to develop a response strategy that would protect security while not creating suspicion about why she was avoiding media contact. Major Rodriguez worked with Sarah to prepare responses that would satisfy the journalist's questions while revealing nothing about the true nature of Miguel's service. Sarah was trained in techniques for redirecting conversations, providing general information without specific details, and maintaining emotional authenticity while concealing important facts. The experience was nerve-wracking but successful, and it gave Sarah confidence that she could navigate similar situations in the future. The journalist encounter also highlighted another dimension of Sarah's new reality. She realized that her knowledge made her a potential target for people seeking information about classified operations. Intelligence agencies, foreign governments, criminal organizations, and even well-meaning journalists might all view her as a valuable source of sensitive information. This realization added a new layer of security consciousness to her daily life and required her to develop awareness of potential surveillance or approach attempts. The military provided Sarah with basic personal security training, including techniques for recognizing surveillance, identifying potential threats, and responding to suspicious contacts. This training was sobering because it emphasized that her knowledge of Miguel's service had made her part of a world where such precautions were necessary. The ordinary librarian who had simply wanted to honor her brother's memory now needed to think like someone who possessed valuable intelligence. As autumn approached, Sarah began to adapt to what she recognized would be her new normal. The initial shock of learning about Miguel's classified service had given way to a more complex ongoing process of integrating this knowledge into her daily life. She developed routines and mental frameworks that allowed her to honor Miguel's true achievements while maintaining the security requirements that protected both his legacy and national interests. The tattoo that had started as a simple memorial had become a daily reminder of the extraordinary nature of her situation. Each morning as she dressed for work, carefully ensuring that the insignia remained hidden, Sarah was reminded that she carried secrets that connected her to operations that had saved lives and prevented terrorist attacks. The weight of this knowledge was significant, but it also provided a deeper understanding of Miguel's sacrifice that helped her find new meaning in her loss. Sarah's relationship with grief itself had been transformed by her new knowledge. The simple sadness of losing a beloved brother had been replaced by a more complex emotional landscape that included pride, anger, confusion, and a sense of connection to something larger than her personal loss. She was no longer just mourning Miguel the person, but honoring Miguel the unsung hero whose achievements could never be fully recognized. The consequences of learning the truth about her tattoo had been far-reaching and permanent. Sarah Martinez had entered a world where knowledge carried responsibility, where personal choices had national security implications, and where the simple act of remembering a loved one required careful consideration of classified information protocols. But she had also gained access to a truth about her family's history that few people were ever permitted to know, and had become part of a community of people who shared the burden and honor of protecting secrets that kept the country safe. As Sarah looked toward the future, she understood that her life had been permanently changed by the revelation of what her tattoo really meant. The ordinary woman who had seemed unremarkable to everyone around her had become part of an extraordinary story that would continue to shape her choices and relationships for the rest of her life. The consequences of carrying classified knowledge were significant, but they had also connected her to her brother's true legacy in ways that simple mourning could never have achieved. 1 year after Chief Warrant Officer David Chin spotted the classified insignia on Sarah Martinez's shoulder blade, her life had been transformed in ways that went far beyond simply learning the truth about her brother's service. The ordinary librarian who had gotten a memorial tattoo had become part of a carefully managed intelligence community, a guardian of national secrets, and ultimately, a bridge between the classified world of special operations and the families who sacrificed without ever knowing the full extent of their loved one's service. The transformation had not been easy or immediate. Sarah had spent months learning to navigate the complex requirements of her new security status while processing the emotional implications of Miguel's true story. But, gradually, she had discovered that her unique position, as both a civilian and someone with legitimate access to classified information, created opportunities to contribute to causes larger than her personal grief and healing. The first major opportunity came when Colonel Harrison approached her with an unusual request. The military had identified several other families whose loved ones had served in Shadow Wing or similar classified units. These families were struggling with the same incomplete information and unresolved grief that Sarah had experienced before learning the truth about Miguel's service. The military wanted to develop a program that could provide these families with appropriate information about their loved one's service without compromising ongoing security operations. Sarah's experience made her an ideal candidate to help develop this program. She understood both the emotional needs of grieving families and the security requirements that governed classified information. More importantly, she had successfully navigated the process of learning difficult truths about a loved one's service and integrating that knowledge into a healthy, ongoing life. Her insight could help the military create protocols that would honor the sacrifices of both the fallen soldiers and their families. Working with Dr. Patricia Williams and a team of military psychologists, Sarah helped design a family notification program that would provide cleared family members with appropriate information about their loved one's classified service. The program included careful screening processes to identify families who could handle such information responsibly, graduated disclosure protocols that revealed sensitive information in manageable stages, and ongoing support systems to help families process the emotional complexity of learning the truth about their losses. Sarah's role in developing this program marked the beginning of her formal relationship with the military intelligence community. She was given a civilian security clearance that allowed her to work on projects related to family support and classified operations disclosure. The work was meaningful and challenging, providing her with a sense of purpose that went far beyond her previous library career. The program's first test case involved Maria Santos, whose husband had died in a shadow wing operation 3 years earlier. Like Sarah, Maria had been told only that her husband had died serving his country, with no details about the specific nature of his service. The grief and unanswered questions had consumed Maria's life, affecting her relationships with her children and preventing her from moving forward emotionally. Sarah participated directly in Maria's disclosure process, sharing her own experience of learning the truth about Miguel's service and helping Maria understand the significance of the information she was receiving. The process was emotionally intense for both women, but it ultimately provided Maria with the closure and understanding she had been seeking for years. More importantly, it demonstrated that the program could successfully provide families with meaningful information about their loved one's classified service without compromising security. The success of the initial program led to Sarah taking on an expanded role within the military community. She was invited to participate in policy discussions about family support for personnel involved in classified operations, and her civilian perspective proved valuable in developing approaches that honored both security requirements and family needs. Her unique position as someone who had discovered the truth about classified service allowed her to serve as an advocate for other families while maintaining absolute discretion about sensitive operations. Sarah's work with military families also led to unexpected personal growth and healing. Through helping other people process their grief and confusion about their loved one's classified service, she gained new perspective on her own experience with Miguel's death. She realized that her journey from ordinary librarian to security-cleared family advocate represented not just a response to learning the truth about Miguel's service, but a continuation of the values and dedication that had motivated Miguel's own service. The transformation was not without challenges. Sarah's new role required her to maintain multiple layers of security consciousness and to navigate complex relationships with both military personnel and civilian families. She had to develop skills in crisis counseling, security protocol management, and delicate communication that went far beyond anything her library training had provided. The emotional demands of working with grieving families while maintaining strict confidentiality about ongoing operations required constant vigilance and careful self-care. 2 years after the Apache pilot's initial sighting of her tattoo, Sarah faced her most significant professional challenge. She was asked to participate in a congressional briefing about family support for personnel involved in classified operations. The briefing would require her to testify before a House subcommittee about the need for better family notification protocols, while carefully avoiding any disclosure of specific operational details or unit information. Preparing for the congressional testimony required months of collaboration with military lawyers, intelligence officers, and congressional staff to develop presentation materials that would convey the importance of family support without revealing classified information. Sarah worked with speechwriters to craft testimony that would be emotionally compelling while remaining within strict security boundaries. The process was challenging but ultimately successful, and Sarah's testimony helped secure increased funding for family support programs within the special operations community. The congressional appearance marked Sarah as one of the few civilians with both the security clearance and personal experience necessary to advocate publicly for military families affected by classified operations. Her unique position led to invitations to speak at military conferences, participate in policy discussions, and consult on family support initiatives across multiple branches of the armed services. Sarah's expanding role also brought unexpected recognition within the military community. She received a Civilian Service Award for her contributions to family support programs, and her work was cited in several policy documents about improving communication with families of personnel involved in classified operations. The recognition was personally meaningful, but, more importantly, it validated the significance of the work she was doing and its impact on other military families. The most profound aspect of Sarah's transformation was the evolution of her relationship with Miguel's memory and legacy. The simple grief and loss she had initially felt had been replaced by a complex understanding of Miguel's true achievements and their ongoing significance. She no longer mourned just a beloved brother who had died too young, but honored an unsung hero whose sacrifices had saved lives and protected national security. The tattoo that had started as a memorial had become a daily reminder of the responsibility that came with her knowledge and position. Each morning as she prepared for work, Now at a small office within the Department of Defense rather than the Phoenix Public Library, Sarah was reminded that she carried both secrets and obligations that connected her to operations happening around the world. The insignia on her shoulder blade had become not just a symbol of Miguel's service, but a mark of her own commitment to serving military families and protecting classified operations. Sarah's personal life had also evolved in unexpected ways. Her security clearance and unique position within the military community had led to relationships with people who shared her understanding of the complexities of classified service. She had begun dating Michael Torres, a former special operations officer who had transitioned to civilian work in defense contracting. Their relationship was built on shared understanding of the sacrifices and secrecy that surrounded classified military service, and it provided Sarah with companionship that honored both her personal needs and her security responsibilities. Looking back on the journey that had begun with a simple decision to get a memorial tattoo, Sarah marveled at the transformation that had occurred in her life. The ordinary woman who had once felt unremarkable and invisible had become a vital part of a community dedicated to protecting both national secrets and the families affected by those secrets. Her work had real impact on people's lives, providing closure and understanding to families who had carried unanswered questions for years. The most significant realization of Sarah's transformation was understanding that there are no truly ordinary people, only ordinary circumstances waiting for extraordinary events to reveal hidden depths and unexpected purposes. Her brother Miguel had appeared to be an unremarkable soldier until his true achievements were revealed. Sarah herself had appeared to be a simple librarian until circumstances revealed her capacity for handling complex security responsibilities and advocating for military families. The Apache pilot who had spotted her tattoo and recognized its significance had set in motion a series of events that transformed not just Sarah's life, but the lives of dozens of other military families who benefited from the programs she helped develop. Chief Warrant Officer David Chin's decision to report what he had seen had led to revelations and changes that extended far beyond the original security investigation. As Sarah approached the 5th anniversary of Miguel's death, she prepared to participate in a memorial ceremony that would honor fallen special operations personnel whose sacrifices could never be publicly acknowledged. The ceremony would be attended by family members who had gained clearance to learn the truth about their loved one's service, military personnel who had served alongside the honored dead, and government officials who understood the significance of classified operations. Sarah's role in the ceremony would be to speak about the importance of family support and the value of providing families with appropriate information about their loved one's classified service. Her words would honor not just Miguel, but all the unsung heroes whose achievements had been hidden by the requirements of national security. The transformation of Sarah Martinez from ordinary librarian to security-cleared family advocate represented more than just a personal journey of discovery and growth. It demonstrated the potential for unexpected events to reveal extraordinary possibilities within seemingly ordinary lives, and the power of family love to bridge worlds that are never meant to meet. The woman who had seemed unremarkable to everyone around her had become remarkable through circumstances she never could have imagined. Her classified tattoo, spotted by an Apache pilot who recognized its significance, had led to revelations that changed not just her understanding of her family's history, but her entire life purpose and identity. Sarah Martinez had discovered that sometimes the most important stories begin with the simplest acts of love and remembrance, and that the symbols we choose to mark our bodies with can have consequences and meaning far beyond our understanding. Her journey proved that there are no truly ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, only extraordinary people waiting for the right moment to reveal their true potential and purpose.